Hey, welcome everybody. Thomas Dimitrovich here. I'm about 3 minutes late. I apologize. I was on a phone call and lost sidetrack. So Eric Hammond in the house. Good morning. Good morning or good afternoon. It's actually 12 o'clock. Who we got? We got Steve. Good to see you. Happy New Year, everybody. Yeah, man, I'll tell you what, it is good. I can't believe it's 2025. Unbelievable. Oh, wait, yeah, it's 2025. Hey, Felix Sandoval in the house. Blessed. David Englehart. I look forward to remaining HJ question of when to know you have legitimate documentation required. All right, I will try to answer that one. That's going to be fun. And just became a member. What is that? Just became a member. Excellent. All right. Happy New Year. Happy New Year. And we got Steve. And a very good question, David. As the requirements of the documentation help raise awareness of compliance. Yeah, I think I might have something to help us there. Hey, Steve, we were just talking this morning, brother. Good to see you. Online. I know you are at Steve is out there at a restaurant somewhere, I think, right now. Ahmed, good afternoon. And then we got Pratik. Happy New Year. Excellent. All right. So I should try to put this on. How do I focus? Do not disturb. All right. So I put that on do not disturb so that I don't get all of these. How do I? Boom. Take the comments off. All right. So what I did, so I'll tell you what prompted this. I got I was getting notifications over the holidays of people who were making comments on some of my videos. And I remembered I haven't done a Q&A Friday. Eli Markovic, hola, ¿qué pasa? ¿Cómo está? So I thought I would do a code Q&A Friday to answer some of those questions. So I, just so an FYI, I also spent some time working on my website. And you'll see this, hopefully this works. Is it monitor A or B? There it is, monitor B. So I did my Q&A Friday. So I changed the format, and I've got my top 9, 2024, and I got OSHA's new guidance out there. So I'm going to use this more. And I know whenever I create the information here, it automatically emails it. I also have my other, oh, hey, David, thank you. I appreciate that. All right, so the first one, I'm going to focus in on this one. This was the video. Man, I'll tell you what, David, when I look back at some of my older videos, they are embarrassing. OMG. I mean, really embarrassing. So, the selective coordination tables, I did a presentation on these tables, and I grabbed this snapshot of these two curves, and I think I found the presentation. I don't know if it's the exact same no, it may or may not be the exact same presentation, but this is the curves that were in there. And I give this quiz to everybody. Hey, Nihad, you and I got a chat, Nihad, on our presentation. Happy New Year to you, sir. I think you're over in Egypt right now, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe this weekend or next week we can get our heads together. I saw your email, but we need to connect. So I give this presentation whenever I do an educational program on selective coordination. I show these two curves. And my basic question is, do they selectively coordinate? Yes, no, or maybe. And remember when I did this, and this was probably during COVID 2020 when I started all of this technical social distancing network. And take a look at I think he's got it up there still. I just want to make sure. Yeah, Felix still has that his logo on Facebook. We did. I think I put this for that, if I'm not mistaken. But I would typically put this on even if I drew it on a board and said, look, I won't go any further if you can answer this question. So when I look at these curves, and when a lot of engineers look at these curves, and anybody, I mean, I'll say engineers, and I use the term engineers, in that when I say, I'm trying to collect my thoughts here because I've got sensory overload going on. But I'll have engineers look at this, but inspectors, electricians, contractors, whomever, when they look at these curves, they'll say, wow, I've got complete separation all the way down to 0.01 seconds, and they look great. And the comment that came in from the commenter on this specific video, he says, as plotted, the 20 and 150 amp breakers were coordinated for the situation shown. That is because the plot truncated the rightmost portion of the 20 amp breaker at a desired level for analysis. And he's talking about this being truncated off, and that is not true. And I can understand why he may think that. It looks like it's truncated, but it is not truncated. That is a BAB 20 trip curve. So I'm going to go and I am going to take a look. Here we go. All right, so I am going to do this. I don't know if I can do this. Me and iPad? Yes, look at that. It worked. So I got my handy dandy pencil. These are the trip curves for the circuit breaker that we have pictured there. And that would say be a two-pole. I said a two-pole 10 to 125 amp trip curve. If you look at, these are all in currents in percent of circuit breaker trip unit rating. I'm getting a lot of questions over here. Oh, man. Happy Friday. Yes, I am. Oh, Alan Bernstein. Hey, welcome, brother. Good to see you. Cool. Wait, good old TSDN. Absolutely right. And Nihad is in Cairo. So this is our the two-pole quick lag, and that's the bolt-on breakers. Hopefully you got a cup of coffee. So what you'll notice, the top is in current in percent of breaker trip unit rating. So if it is a, let me do this. Hopefully I can do this. There we go. If it's a, if you look at that, that's 100%. That's 100%. That means for a, I think I had a 20 amp breaker, 20 amp BAB. This would be 20 amps. Okay, that's what that would be. Done. Delete screenshot. Okay, so if we come down to this, what you'll notice, now I'm going to go back over here. Notice the bottom of this screen. this TCC curve, and if you go to SKM and any of these manufacturers, they stop it down at 0.01 seconds. So if I come back to this, I'll point out the fact that this is 0.01 seconds. So what you don't see on this other screen is anything down here. All of this is not being shown. So if I drew a line across, what you will see is the instantaneous comes down and it hits basically 0.01 seconds. If I come back over to this, that circuit breaker is cut off at 0.01 seconds, but it doesn't, what do you call the, I call that the, what do I call that? The boot? That boot, that in the blue, you see how it curves over to the right? The BAB breaker curves over to the right, but it is below 0.01 seconds. So you don't see it when you plot, when you go to SKM, Easy Power, EDSA, whatever. You don't see the instantaneous boot, so to speak, region because it is below 0.01 seconds. So in this trip curve, I am not cutting off the curve at the fault current for the 20 amp breaker. That is the 20 amp breaker. In fact, I'm not plotting available fault current on this slide at all, which is why the answer to this question is maybe because you don't have enough information. How can an electrical engineer design a fault-tolerant microgrid? Hey, we got Bill Clinton in the house. Welcome, Bill. I haven't seen you in so freaking long. I hope you're doing well. How can an electrical engineer design a fault-tolerant microgrid that integrates renewable energy, compensates for voltage sags, and minimizes harmonic distortion using real-time predictive control? By calling Eaton and having Eaton design it for you. I don't know the answer to that question, Bill. Mr. Clinton, President Clinton. So if you look at this question, what I said was, what I'm not showing you on that TCC curve, the fault current values matter, and I'm not plotting them. And I'm not cutting off any of these curves at a fault current value. So if my fault current was 500 amps, if it was a ground fault current, if it was a bolted fault current, if it was a three-phase bolted fault current and the maximum current you could possibly get, then it would selectively coordinate because that 500 amps is not greater than the instantaneous region of the F150 breaker. If the available fault current was 1,000 amps, then I couldn't tell you based upon the time current characteristic curve. So whenever you get, and you're looking at trip curves, anytime that you're looking at trip curves, you have to consider what the available fault current is for those trip curves. So if you're looking at time current characteristic curves, the engineer should be plotting on that time current curve what the available fault currents are at the various parts. In fact, just like in this image, I have the one-line diagram up at the top right-hand corner of the TCC curve. On every TCC curve that I did personally for my projects, I would always put the portion of the one-line diagram on, and I did it back when we did onion skins. So back, that's when I did them by hand. But I would put the portion of the one-line diagram on the TCC curve in the top right-hand side. When I started using SKM, what I did was I drew the little portion of the TCC and I printed it, cut it out, pasted it, and I copied the page, and I would have that one-line diagram on the actual TCC curve. That was before Adobe Premiere and all these other cool tools. I'm showing my age, but in any case, you need to have the perspective. You need to know what the fault current is that both of those breakers are expected to see. Remember, a fault downstream of that BAB20 is going to be seen by the F-150, the breaker, not the truck. All right? So if I go back to the question, as plotted, the 20 amp and 50 amp, 150 amp breakers were coordinated for the situation shown. Now, coordinated, I would say yes. If he's using the term as it is and not using selective coordination as the term, but using coordination, then coordination is not selective coordination, because selective coordination is for all currents, all times. Coordination could just be in the overload region, right? So if I look back at this, curve, then I am coordinated for all currents below right where that, see if this is, if that's reference current times 1, so that's 1,000. No, that's 1,000. Where's it at? That's 1,000 amps. I'd have to look. I'd have to look it back on SKM, because if that's 100 and that's 1,000, current in amps times 1, so that's 100 amps. This is 100 amps, and then this right here, this line coming down, right in here is 1,000. So that's 1,000, 900, 800, around 700 amps is where the leading edge of that blue curve starts. So any current greater than or less than 700 amps, I coordinate for. Now that could be my overload region, etc. It could very well be a ground fault current, I don't know. Depends on the system. Or an arcing current, depends on the system. So, but in any case, this curve is not showing the fault currents. So let's go back over to the question. And he says, that is because the plot truncated the rightmost portion of the 20 amp breaker as the analysis. And I can understand why he may think that. I thought I made myself clear in the video. I have to go back and watch the video. But I'm trying to be clear right now that I'm not showing current on that screen. I am not truncating it. I just showed the time current characteristic curve, and how the TCC curve basically at 0.01 seconds is where everything above 0.01 seconds is above where that instantaneous region is. So we're not showing it in the SKM application. If you truncated the 20 amp curve at 1500 amps or 3000 amps, you would have seen the same result as the charts show. Well, I wouldn't if it was 3000 amps. So let's assume, let's go back to this. Nope. Let's go back to this. If I truncated the BAB, if that BAB did have the foot, I knew we don't call it a shoe, we should call it a foot. If the foot came over to the right and it went to 1500 amps, I would not be able to determine coordination, because the 1500 amps is in the instantaneous region of the blue curve. So if it was 1500 amps, if it was 3000 amps, if that's 1000, this is 2000, this is 3000 amps is way over here. into the instantaneous, well into the instantaneous region of that blue curve. So from the TCC curve, I still would not be able to tell you whether or not those two breakers selectively coordinate because I have overlap in that instantaneous region. But that's not even the case here because that BAB breaker's foot is below 0.01 seconds and you're not seeing it. If you download the manufacturer's information, you would see the foot of where it crosses over. So you have, let's make this a little bigger. You have your 0.01 second line right here. The instantaneous is about right there. So if that's 0.01, this is 0.009. There's 0.009. This is 0.008, 007, 006, and 005. So my instantaneous clearing time for this BAB breaker is somewhere between 0.008 and 0.009 seconds, which is faster than 0.01 seconds, and why you don't see it on the screen. And now if I went into SKM and changed my TCC curve, I could show that information, but we never do. Now, what I do in what I do in the what I did for that presentation and what I'm going to show you here is that to understand what happens in that circuit breaker region, I will use, I'm going to do this, template, and boom, ba bum, 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 bum. I will use, where is it? I had a template in here and now I don't seize it. Letter, legal, nope, letter, apply. All right, so if I, what we do for those tables is we basically take two breakers. We put them in a lab. And in this case here, I would have the F150 upstream of the BAB20. And we basically have a source. And we drive current through both of those devices, and we keep increasing the available fault current until they both trip. Now, once we know the fault current value or the current value, I'm in a lab, so I'm driving current through both of these circuit breakers. When I hit that number and I know they both open, we plot that in this table. So we know that for a BAB20 downstream of an F150, 1500 amps is where that point is, that line of demarcation, when they both open. So what I can definitively tell you based upon the tables and based upon the testing, that when that I short circuit for this pair of breakers is greater than 1500 amps. So if I have 1500 amps, if I'm greater than 1500 amps, then they will both open. And you don't have selective coordination. And I don't care if that is a three-phase bolted fault current value. I don't care if it's a ground fault current value. I don't care if it's an arcing fault current value. What I do care about is that it's an RMS current that is passing through there. Okay? So that is going to cause both of those circuit breakers to open. Now, if I think about that with regard to the time current characteristic curve, then based upon the tables, I could plot that 1500 amps and say, look, I selectively coordinate for fault current of 1,000 amps because it's less than the 1500 amps. It is into the instantaneous region of that upstream F150, but I know because of the selective coordination tables and which is based upon the testing, that the downstream breaker is going to open and the upstream breaker will stay closed. And hence I have selective coordination for that three-phase bolted fault current value. Now, 1,000 amps of three-phase bolted fault is pretty daggone low. And it's probably very rare. But in any case, that's the case. Now, let me go back. I think Bill Clinton had something to say. What's Billy Boy? Billy Boy says, let me go back. How to achieve selective coordination in a complex distribution system with varying load profiles while minimizing system downtime, ensuring optimal fault isolation across multiple protected devices. Remember, Bill, I don't care about the load currents. I'm not worried about load currents. So load profiles, whether or not you have lights on or off, when I plot curves, when I think about the load current, if I was just thinking about load currents, I'm going to put a plot here. If I had, this is what you would typically do. Let's say you have a breaker, okay, like this, and I'll show the shoe, and then I have an upstream, and I'll say we'll cut this off at I short circuit. And let's say that I have an electronic trip unit upstream, like this. Now, and let's say that, let's just do this, because you gotta do this. You're gonna have multiple breakers, and we'll say this is breaker A, so this is A, and we'll say this is breaker B, and this is B. Now, what we would typically do, Bill, is we would, breaker B is, say, a branch. Say this is, I don't know, we'll call this L for lighting. We'll put M for motors. And we'll put a square box, and we'll call this control panel, industrial control panels. And let's say that breaker B, what we would typically do if you're doing a selective coordination study and you're looking at a scenario like this, you would pick, let's say that this is 100 amp and this is 70 amp and this is 50 amp. You would pick the largest breaker downstream and you would plot that. So one plot largest downstream breaker. So that's the first thing you do. If the largest downstream breaker works with everything upstream, then the smaller downstream breakers are going to work fine. But I would only plot the largest downstream breaker from A. Then I would plot A, and I would do that comparison. And I want separation in the overload region, so I'll have to verify that. In all of these regions, I can't have overlap because this is your overload region. That's your overload region of the system. And I can have an overload, so if downstream of B, if that lighting load, if I add too much lighting load, I'm going to open device B anywhere between those two times. and I'm not going to open device A. So I have coordination in the overload region, right? So my loads, regardless of my loads, I have coordination. Now, for other reasons, you're going to want to take a look at your loads to make sure that you don't overload the circuit, okay? But if I have a 100 amp branch circuit feeding 100 amps worth of lighting loads, if that would ever happen, if I'm feeding 100 amps worth of load, my conductor is sized for 100 amps. If I add too much load, then my overcurrent device is going to open. What I don't want is I don't want my upstream feeder to open in the overload region. So hence I want the separation upstream. The challenge on selective coordination is not necessarily the overload region. It's the short circuit region of when, if my fault current at this point was, and let's do this. I need to hit the delete and just partial. So if I take this and I say that this shoe came over to here, now my I short circuit at, we'll call this panel 1, at panel 1, if my I short circuit is in the instantaneous region of both of those circuit breakers, then I know I do not selectively coordinate at that 100 amp breaker, and I don't know, say this is a 400 amp breaker. That 400 amp breaker and that 100 amp breaker do not selectively coordinate because of the fault current at panel 1 is greater than the instantaneous of both of those overcurrent devices. I would have to fix that. Now, in the case that I was showing you earlier, I'm not showing any of this primarily because I don't go over until below 0.01 seconds. So if my fault current is at that value, regardless of whether or not I have a downstream breaker that shows the foot, that fault current at panel 1 is greater than the instantaneous of that device and that device. I know I have to address the issue, even though the time current characteristic curve is not going to depict a problem because I'm not showing the foot. All right. So, I don't care necessarily about the loads because the loads are going to be taken care of because I need to make sure that they're less than the conductor ampere rating and less than the circuit breaker long time pickup. What I care about is the available fault currents, which will change depending upon the configuration of a complex system. So your comment was load profiles while in a complex distribution system. Now, in a complex distribution system, I'm going to want to calculate my fault current. So let's do this. Let's do this, Bill. If I had something like this going on, okay, and let's say I had a double-ended switchgear, okay, and I had all of these things going on, and I had a utility here and a utility here. I'd say this is complex. I mean, I'm doing a main time main configuration. I would need to, let's say that, for example, I've got local generation connected to that bus. And let's say that the generation runs in parallel with the utility. I would need to run through the different scenarios. I'd have to say, which scenario gives me the most fault current at this panel 1? Okay. which scenario in the configuration of my power distribution system, and maybe I have motors here too, right? I've got motors, I got big motors, I got little motors, and maybe I've got a motor over here. I would have to consider all that motor contribution as well. I would want to calculate the maximum available fault current that I could get at panel 1 and then do my coordination. So the more complicated the system becomes, it's not a challenge of loads other than if those loads are contributing to fault current. My challenge is to determine what is the configuration of the one-line diagram that gives me my most fault current at each of these panels, and then do my evaluations. I might say this is a very weak source. I may do all of my fault current calculations off of that utility source because it is the larger of the two. I may turn all of my motors on if that is a feasible situation. It may be that I say, look, you're never going to have all these motors on, and I would come up with rules of thumb, or my engineering, not rules of thumb, but my assumptions. I would make my assumptions. I could make an assumption based upon an analysis that at any given time, only 50% of the motors are going to be on. So I'm going to make that assumption, and I would base that assumption on input. So my goal would be to calculate the maximum available fault current for the system. All right, so I'm not worried about the fault currents, and the complex systems basically are going to be driven by the sources, not necessarily the loads, unless they're motor loads. And then, Bill, I would do my analysis with my time current characteristic curves, and I got to maintain my separation in the overload regions, and then I have to deal with the available fault currents by either using the tables or adding delays and keeping the available fault current outside of the instantaneous region. So that's how I would address that. All right. Hey, Ryan Jackson is in the house. Happy New Year, Ryan. Hopefully you are well. Eric Hammond, wouldn't all circuit breakers overlap in the instantaneous region with enough current? Yeah, Eric. Again, don't think about it as an overlap, because in the problem that we run into, this is what I run into this a lot. I call them artists. They're no longer engineers. They are artists. I mean, if I'm just looking for separation of curves, I'm not doing engineering work. I've got to understand the available fault current. And in this case here, these two curves do not overlap, yet I have a selective coordination issue. So we can't just think about selective coordination as pretty curves that shouldn't overlap. That is not an appropriate assumption. It could get you in trouble. And it has gotten people in trouble. I have seen selective coordination studies that aren't selectively coordinated, and by very smart people. And it's just because of the way they were taught. I put these two curves for an engineering friend of mine who's very, very sharp. And I when I first came across this, this was a real world example. I mean, I had somebody send an email out and said, hey, I love these two breakers. Look how great they selectively coordinate. And my response to it was, well, what's the available fault current? And I got the phone call, and they said, what do you mean, what's the fault current? I said, well, I need to know the fault current to know whether or not they selectively coordinate. And the individual made the statement that said, okay, well, 10,000 amps. And I went, oh, well, if it's 10,000 amps flowing through both of those breakers, what do you think is going to happen? And there was a long pause on the phone. And the individual said, they're both going to open. I said, right. Is that selectively coordinated? And it was like a light bulb going off in that person's head, because I know they know better, But when they look at those curves, they make that assumption. That curve, that BAB breaker is not getting cut off. All right, let me keep going here. Ryan Jackson's, what in all circuit breakers are Eric? Okay, so that was our last one. Yep. So my only advice, Eric, is, and I do this too, you know, I talk about overlapping in the instantaneous region, but any fault current that exceeds the instantaneous pickup of both overcurrent devices, both breakers. All right. Tom, I am guessing is probably for a historical reason, but I'm wondering why all TCC curves are not showing any time below 0.01 seconds. It seems to me that showing 0.001 seconds would have cleared all doubt. You know what? I don't disagree with you, and I don't know where that started. In fact, I was surprised. If I just go to, I'm going to go to eaton.com/TCC. I'm going to grab molded case circuit breakers, and I'm going to grab the FD frame. I think I know why. If I look, whoa, almost spilt my coffee. All of these cut off at 0.01 seconds. And it's, look, this, yeah, that one does too. 0.01 seconds. Oh, look at this, Nihad. There's 0.001. There's 0.001 for the instantaneous region, and we show what happens below 0.01 seconds on our TCC curves. So we do provide data down to 0.001. I was going to say, no, we don't. What about fuses? Busman fuse curves. Fuse time current characteristic curves. Here's your class, there's your fast acting, here's your CF fuse. Let's see what they do here. And I know why they don't show below 0.01 seconds, because now we're getting into the current limiting region and we use our current limitation curves. All of the fuses are current limiting in nature, so they're not going to have that. So Nihad, I would say it's probably, I would agree with you. If we showed more information, it would smack you in the face. I would 100% agree with you that it would be hard for an engineer or anybody to say something either does or does not selectively coordinate because it is on the TCC curve. So I don't disagree with you. Don't you agree? I agree. Greetings, Tom. From Robert from Omaha is in the house. And Robert's saying hi to everybody. Everybody's saying hi to Robert. Eaton owns Busman. Yes, we do. We acquired Busman through the Cooper acquisition. That was the second largest acquisition on the face of the earth that year. I can't remember what year it was. Busman folks are brilliant and got the NEC to require perfect coordination in emergency systems. You know what? They probably are the ones that brought it up for Article 700, 701, and 708. The other group that jumped on board with that was NICA and the IBW, and I couldn't understand IBW. You're gonna love this, Alan. If you think about, so let's go back to this. If you think about how do you solve a problem like this, right? How would you solve an issue where the available fault current was up here, okay? and it was in the instantaneous region, so it's greater than both of those breakers. How would I solve that problem? I could select a different circuit breaker that does something like this. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so now I know that the BAB downstream breaker is going to trip faster than 0.01 seconds. And my upstream breaker is going to take, I don't know, upwards of, say, 30 cycles. So we'll say 30 cycles. So what I used to say was, when I drive a selectively coordinated system, what does that do? If my breaker A had 30 cycles of a delay, that means, and say that's an upstream breaker, that's a feeder breaker. So if I looked at my one-line diagram, let's say that I had a main and I had that, and I did a main lug only panel board, because in a selectively coordinated system, you're going to see a lot of main lug only panel boards. Let's say that I did this. If this was breaker A and I had a 30 cycle delay to meet selective coordination requirements because the fault currents were so high, then the incident energy here is going through the roof. Okay? And why is that? Because my protecting overcurrent device has got a 30 cycle delay. So I couldn't understand, and I remember going out to Philadelphia and a few other locations, and I would teach this, and I would say, look, if you're going to selectively coordinate the system, you are going to drive higher incident energy values in the power distribution system because you're adding intentional delays. I may not have that same problem with fuses, but I will definitely have that problem with circuit breakers. So I would argue, I would say, look, you have higher incident energy because if your available fault current is less than the instantaneous of the upstream breaker, then your arcing currents are definitely going to be less than the upstream instantaneous. And now your shelf in the curve, if it's 30 cycle delay, then you got 30 cycles, right? So it's your clearing time is depending upon the short time delay that you implement, if you even implement one. So there's no requirement to implement one. And I couldn't understand how, from an IBEW perspective, our electrical workers, IBEW was all over it. They supported it. And their reasoning was really enlightening for me. Their statement was, they said, Tom, I had multiple people tell me this. They said, if I had a lack of selective coordination, say at, I don't know, a complex, call it a large industrial application or commercial building, and you called me because the main tripped, they have to find the problem before energizing or turning anything back on again. And if your main trips, there's a problem somewhere in this facility, OSHA tells you just can't turn things back on. It makes it very difficult for them to identify where the problem is. But if it's selectively coordinated, they know exactly where the problem is. They can clear the fault and then check the breaker and then re-energize. It makes their life simpler and safer. And then as we talked about the incident energy, that's when Local 98, Jim Dollard, put the public input in to say, hey, well, let's put a 240-67 and 240-87, an arc reduction technology for these larger breakers, because that's where you're going to be adding these intentional delays. And we basically introduced an arc reduction requirement in the code. So it was... Remember, Alan, there was a lot of people playing in that sandbox, and there were different motivating factors. All right, Happy New Year, Nihad. So for small circuits in an emergency system, bring on current limiting fuses to get perfect. So this is the other part of the question. The tables. So if I go back to the second item, he's been covering this in his courses since 2006, at which time GE engineers attended the course, decided to start making up the coordination charts that thankfully most of other manufacturers now provide. I would argue well before 2006, we have had selective coordination tables for fuses. Fuses were the first ones to introduce this, and that was a long time ago. The fuse ratio tables. Oh, look at that. Look at that. Look at this. 1, 2, 3. My videos, top of the Google list. That is something else. That tells you success. So selective coordination fuses. Here we go. So we have the fuse manufacturers have had this for a long time. And it was around the 2005. And what drove the tables back at that time frame was the code change. Remember, selective coordination hit the code around the 2005 NEC. And once that hit as a requirement, the breaker manufacturers realized we need to do something. So all 4 breaker manufacturers began their testing in well before 2005 hit the streets, because they saw that coming. But even before that, the fuse manufacturers already had their tables. And what they identify here is that when you have a load side and line side fuse, if you maintain, for the most part, a lot of these are 2-to-1 ratios, but you'll see some 8-to-1 ratios in here. If I zoom in, there's an 8-to-1. So if I have a load size RK5 downstream of a low peak RK1, it's an 8-to-1 ratio. But if I have an LPJ or a TCF downstream of that low peak, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So the fuse people try to drive that current limiting nature and just say, look, maintain a 2-to-1 ratio and you're done. And what that means is, and here's the nice thing about that. That means that if I drew my TCC curve, I'm getting to you, David Engelhardt. Don't worry, buddy. If I drew my TCC curves, and I'm going to draw 2 fuse curves, say that's one, and let's say that this is another. And let's say that this is 200,000 amps. If I had if I had 200,000 amps flowing through both of these, that fuse would open and this fuse would stay closed up to the interrupting rating. So for all currents, the fuse, because of the physics, takes fault current out of the picture as long as I maintain a 2-to-1 ratio. So if this is a 100 amp fuse, this has to be a 200 amp or greater. And we know that because of these tables. And that is test data and etc. So the fuse industry, Alan, had this done a while ago. It wasn't Alan. Who was it? Yeah. So small circuits being so, and here's the other thing, Alan. And I never realized this until a while ago. And we did testing as part of Eaton. Remember this. I'm going to draw the BAB20, and I'm going to draw the F150. And we said, based upon the circuit breaker tables, 1500 amps is my line of demarcation. If I took that BAB20 if I took the BAB20 out of the picture and I put in a TCF 20 Class J fuse, now it's not 1500 amps, it's the interrupting rating of the upstream breaker. So if that is a 65K breaker, then I selectively coordinate up to 65K. If it's a 22K breaker, I selectively coordinate up to 22K because the TCF fuse takes it out so fast. Now, if I go back to the question, to some of the comments, he said, where's the fuse? There it is. Later, a TCC with a current limiting fuse is plotted, which is what I just showed you, downstream of a breaker. That coordination will work, but that is another place where TCC plots can fool you, which was interesting because he set up above the TCC that breaker was cut off, which was not true. And I guess I would agree with what he's saying, that it can fool you. Just because there was what he calls white space between the current limiting fuse, and what he means is, what he's speaking to is this is the white space. That's in between these two. He's saying just because there is white space between those fuses does not guarantee coordination between them. And I would agree with that. That's why, from an Eaton perspective, we tested those. And what we did learn, though, was that as long as you did not encroach, in what we would do is start there. We would get that downstream fuse as close to this point as we could get it, somewhere in this area, and before it starts encroaching in on that breaker, and we would put it in a lab and it would work every time. So that was Vince Saporita who did most of that testing, and one of his takeaways was, look, he can get pretty daggone close as long as he gets that fuse as close to that shoe as possible, but not encroaching over it. When we put it in a lab, it worked. Now, it worked for all of the Eaton breakers that we tested. Will it work for every Squared E breaker, GE breaker, Siemens breaker? I don't know. But it was a good rule of thumb. All right, so that's what he was commenting on in the TCC, and I called that TCC plots can confuse you, and I agree. Nihad pointed out the 0.01 second issue is one of those issues. That 0.01 second, cutting it off at 0.01 seconds, only looking at what's on the screen, and the fact that any of those breakers, you don't see what's going on below 0.01 seconds. And we have to go to the tables. That is definitely an issue. Now, here's the other statement he made. That is where, again, manufacturer charts with fuses and breakers can guarantee coordination. Here's the issue I have with, I don't necessarily disagree with that. Manufacturer's charts can guarantee selectivity at the three-phase bolted fault current value. I'll tell you what charts do not give you. If I look at, let's do this. I'm hearing all these things. Eaton TCC, Eaton selective coordination. Every manufacturer has selective coordination. That's fuses. Circuit breaker tables. Here we go. Every manufacturer is going to have circuit breaker tables. Now, if you look at the Eaton breaker tables, line side breaker, standard current limiting. So this is the line side. This is the load side. This tells you that if you have a PDG3, 200 amp minimum trip, 250 amp maximum, you would need to go to a PDG3X for a 125 amp frame, 45 amp trip, for a 15 amp breaker downstream, BRBAB, they coordinate up to 3,000 amps. Okay? What you're not getting in this table is this. Let's say I draw my TCC curve and I draw a upstream breaker. Yeah, I'm going to draw an upstream breaker. And let's say that I'm deleting this. Hold on. I started too quick. I'm going to draw an Jeez, oh man, I'm having issues. I'm going to draw an upstream breaker with a delay. Okay. And I'm going to draw a downstream breaker. Oh, let's do this. And I'm going to draw a downstream breaker that does this. Let's say that breaker cuts off there. So I can show a breaker like this. Those tables are going to tell you what happens in the instantaneous region. They're not going to tell you the overload region, your short time delay regions. So you need to make sure you plot those circuit breakers, especially when there is adjustability in the long time region. They don't guarantee, those tables don't guarantee selective coordination in the overload regions. You still have to plot the curve and manage your set points. What the tables address is the three-phase bolted fault current value and what happens in the instantaneous region only. Okay? So many of these breakers that you're looking at all have adjustable trip units. They all have short time delays. They'll have long time delays. They'll have short time pickups and all that jazz. They might even have an adjustable instantaneous. And we ship everything at the lowest set points. So if you install it and think, well, I did the tables, I installed it, I accepted factory defaults, it ain't going to work. You need the set points. All right? So, all right. Let's get back to the questions. Alan, thank you for that. Joseph L. Why is the requirement for healthcare facility coordination only for times 0.1 seconds, while other facilities require selective coordination for all times? Why isn't healthcare more stringent? Joseph, that's a good question. I believe it all came down to money. I'm not on that panel. I've watched the debates and listened to the debates, and I don't agree with 0.1 seconds whatsoever. And I'll tell you what 0.1 seconds is. Let's go back. Let's go back to, someone might be saying, what is 0.1 seconds? Well, I'll show you what 0.1 seconds is. Remember when we showed when I showed this, and I said that we don't know whether or not, we said we need to know what the available fault current is. If the fault currents are high enough, then both are going to open. So you have to compare the TCC curves with the available fault currents, right? So if the available fault current is greater than 1500 amps, you do not have selective coordination. So all currents less that are in region 1 will selectively coordinate. All currents in region 2 may not selectively coordinate. I got to consult the tables. All right. So the answer to that was maybe. Okay. I need to go to, which slide is it? I want to show you 0.1 seconds if I have it in this slide deck. I think I do. I think I do. I think I can. I think I can. Geez, oh man, 0.1 seconds. Where is 0.1 seconds? I do a lot of teaching on how to do it the right way. Oh, here we go. 0.1 seconds. There we go. I am down at slide number 517. So that is slide 156. Hit escape. Here we go. Slide 156, and I will walk through the selectivity for healthcare. 156. I'm going to get to you, David. 156. Here we go. Selective coordination, healthcare. Coordination is 0.1 seconds. So 517.30G, this was the 2014. That's how old this presentation is. And I've been teaching this and making sure that people understand what this is. Now, NEMA came out with a document that said that coordination is localization of an overcurrent condition to minimize outages. Localization of current condition to minimize outages to the circuit or equipment affected, accomplished by the selection and installation of overcurrent protected devices and their ratings or settings, ensuring separation of their time current characteristic curves beyond a specified time period without regard to fault current magnitude, below a specified level of fault current less than our maximum available fault current. So without regard to fault current or below. And I made sure we had the or below, because if I coordinate, let's just do this. Let's say that I have these two, and I know I have available fault current of 20,000 amps, and I know they're both going to open. How? I've got a few things to address when this is a problem. I have to have separation of trip curves, but I have an overlap. I tell people, if you're going to do 0.1 seconds, you need the handy dandy 0.1 second tool. And what do we use? We basically hide everything below 0.1 seconds. Once you hide everything below 0.1 seconds, the problem goes away from an overlap perspective. But remember, the BAB doesn't overlap until below 0.01 seconds. In this case, the shoe is below 0.1 seconds, and we know that with 20,000 amps passing through both of these devices, I'm going to open them both, and that way I don't have selective coordination, and I don't have coordination at 20,000 amps. How do we fix that? We ignore the available fault current. So what 0.1 seconds does is it disregards the available fault current, and it hides everything below 0.1 seconds. So what we did, remember how you said, boy, it would be so much clearer if we expanded down to 0.001 seconds. What they did in healthcare was they ignored everything below 0.1 seconds. So they raised the bar, so to speak, in the time current characteristic curve to hide all of the problems underneath, but they still have to deal with fault currents, so they basically say they disregard that current. And if you look at the language in the code, informational note, the terms coordination and coordinated as do not cover the full range of overcurrent conditions. So all they're doing in healthcare is looking at overload. That's it. I think that clear. Hopefully that helps you understand what 0.1 seconds is. Now, as an engineer, now let's take a look at that. I'll tell you a scenario. I was talking to somebody who was on NFPA 99 and panel 15, and I made the statement. I said, we were having this debate, and my biggest issue with 0.1 seconds is ignoring fault current. Ignoring any current. I don't even compare the most common fault current in a power distribution system, which is ground fault current. I don't even look at whether or not a ground fault current will cause a cascading event in a healthcare system. All I care about is whether or not an overload takes out more than one circuit. And I would probably argue in a lot of those healthcare scenarios, your chances of an overload, you're controlling your circuits so much. I mean, especially in lighting, and emergency lighting and things like that, you have fixed loads. You're sizing your branch circuit. You're not going to overload that circuit. The only way you're going to overload a circuit, I would say maybe in receptacle loads, if you plug too much in, you could cause an overload condition. But from a lighting or any other fixed equipment, you're going to do a load calculation. You're going to calculate that load. You're not going to be turning on enough more equipment. At least you shouldn't be. But in any case, so why is it there? The only thing I can tell you is cost. It adds more cost to the installation, and that's the only thing I can think of. I don't know of any other reason. I can't argue reliability because there's no requirement in the code for you to have 2 or 3 sources feeding a specific load. So if I think about lighting and everything else associated with it, if I lose one branch I'm not talking about losing a source from a utility perspective, but if I have a fault in my power system and it takes out a feeder breaker, there's no requirement in the code for you to have multiple ways to power a load. So, Joseph, I don't know. I don't understand it, but hey, I don't necessarily agree with it. And that's my opinion only, because that's what I'm going to give you as a power systems engineer. I would not design a system without an evaluation of current. Even if I said, look, I'm going to coordinate to a ground fault current, that would be legitimate. I'm drawing the line, and I could back up. I could take IEEE information, and I could tell you it's the most common fault in a power distribution system. It is a ground fault current. I could go out on that limb and say I'm making an engineering decision to coordinate to ground fault current because 3-phase bolted fault currents never occur or hardly ever occur in a normal operating power distribution system. Ground fault currents are your most common fault currents. I could make that argument. I have in the past, and I've used it, not where the code required. If the code requires it in Article 700, 701, 708, that's a done deal. But it's when a client of mine would want a reliable power distribution system, I may go to ground fault currents and make my point to the client that I can get you to a higher level of confidence from a reliability perspective if I ride through and I ensure ground fault currents coordinate. Then I have increased your reliability over ignoring it altogether, and I am not accounting for bolted 3-phase bolted fault current values, which I would argue are less likely in a power distribution system. All right, let's keep going. Why is the requirement for a healthcare facility? Eric Hammond, thanks, I'm understood. Perform the short circuit study first, then selective coordination study based on the available fault current. Amen, brother. A-freaking-men. Alan Bernstein, and if the maximum available fault current is greater than the fuse short circuit current ratings, short circuit ratings, then both fuses blow anyway. If you exceed the interrupting rating of both fuses, then yes, you are going to achieve an unintended rapid disassembly in the field. Because that would be a misapplication. I've been waiting for the collision conflict of selective coordination with arc incident energy concerns, mitigation strategies. Absolutely, Steve. So what I always tell people is you can solve the problems. In fact, Nihad El-Sharif and I are working on a paper for IEEE that shows when you have a design goal of selective coordination, I can address the incident energy through a lot of different technologies. You've got zone selective interlocking, differential relaying, arc reduction maintenance switch, active arc flash mitigation systems. And if you don't want to do any of those, you can do an arc resistant piece of equipment and at least contain the arc flash and vent it out. So there are so many solutions on the table to address the incident energy concerns that I can achieve selective coordination, and I can have a safe, I can minimize the damage to my equipment. Steve Spiker. Is there an app that I can use in our NEC code classes to demonstrate selective coordination on an existing or proposed system? My students are mostly master electricians. Steve, we have an actual demo in our experience center up here in Pittsburgh. We put circuit breakers in, and you can increase the current and watch one open. I am not aware of an app that can demonstrate selective coordination outside of buying something like SKM, EDSA, or Easy Power and showing the curves. I would plot the curves. In fact, it would be even better to manually plot the curves. You can do overlays to help with that, but that would be a master class, so to speak. Yeah, that would be a master class. I don't know, Steve. I'd have to think about that one. Jerry O'Connor, excellent. Listening to videos. You are the man, Jerry. David Engelhardt, advertisement disruptions. Advertisement disruptions. Oh, that's right. It's YouTube. It's tubing. Steve, have you ever seen any exceptions to the 2-to-1 rate? Yeah, I did. Steve, there are some exceptions to the 2-to-1. It's in the tables. So you've got 4-to-1, you've got 8-to-1, 3-to-1. So depending upon what you have upstream and downstream, you'll have the different requirements. So yeah, there are. You've got to make sure you use the tables correctly. Hey, what's up, Sparky? This is the same reason why you wouldn't use combination ratings where you have to selectively coordinate. Yeah, series ratings are. You would not do series ratings in a selectively coordinated environment. I'm assuming that's what you mean by combination ratings. That would be correct, because in series ratings, they're both going to open to do the job to clear that fault current. Healthcare facilities, I think, yes, it's 0.1, not 0.01. It's 0.1 in healthcare. It's not 0.01, Robert. Yep, 0.1. I would say that the healthcare folks went the wrong way. I would agree they went the wrong way. What's up, Sparky? Are there any case studies that show a fully coordinated HCF revealing the actual cost increase? Or, you know what? Yes. I did this. I did this for a healthcare facility, for a few healthcare facilities. In fact, we had one of our interns put that together. We used SKM. I'd have to see if I can resurrect that. I don't have my fingers on it. But here's the thing. Here's the thing, Sparky. I was in California, and I was doing a presentation. I was asked to do a presentation to explain the difference between selective coordination and 0.1 seconds. I had a huge room full of engineers. And in the discussions, I found out that there was an actual healthcare facility owner in the room with their consulting engineer. I loved that opportunity. So I I wonder what is so. I can't remember the numbers. This was a while ago. I did exactly basically what we did here today. I showed selective coordination in 0.1 seconds. Boy, it's 1:23. I showed selective coordination in 0.1 seconds. I gotta make sure I don't have a meeting. Hold on. All right. I showed selective coordination in 0.1 seconds. I explained the difference. And I try to stay out of the debate and argument. I mean, if you want my opinion, I'll tell you. If you're doing 0.1 seconds, you're crazy. If you're saying I'm not doing selective coordination, but I'm going to coordinate to a lower fault current value, and you establish what that value is based upon your engineering knowledge, and you're willing to stake your PE license on it, yeah, I have a lot of respect for you. So, but to ignore fault current, I have no. You're not in my. I don't want you in my class. But in any case. That's just my opinion. I'm giving it to you. I put it out there. So I explained the difference, and I had an individual. One of it was the owner asked that question about the price increase, or there was the consulting engineer. He said, "Well, would you agree that if you selectively coordinate, it's going to be more expensive than if you coordinate at 0.1 seconds?" And I said, "Yeah, you're going to spend more money for a reliable power distribution system. I mean, it's a fact." How much money was the discussion? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, at the time I hadn't done that research, and after the fact I did. Say it's 15%. I don't know. Say it's 10 to 15% over the electrical portion of the installation now. And I think we started talking about those types of numbers. I said about 25% because I wasn't sure. And it was, I believe, less than 25%. It all depends. It really depends on how you lay the system out and all that jazz. But the owner, I looked at the owner and I asked him, I said, would you spend whatever percentage more on the electrical installation to get the reliability? And his point was that a hospital doesn't cost no $250,000, right? You're spending millions of dollars for this hospital. The electrical, I don't know what percentage of a hospital cost is the electrical. I don't know what the electrical percentage is. So according to available data, I just Googled it. According to available data, the electrical portion of a hospital's cost, electrical cost installation. Installation. Let's try installation. According to available data, the electrical portion of a hospital installation cost typically represents around 10% of the total construction costs. 10%. His argument was, the owner's argument was, increasing that number is not a big deal when you look at the overall cost of the entire hospital. But we in our electrical industry, when we look at, say that 10% is, I don't know, $10 million. We think, oh my God, it's $10 million. If I'm going to increase that by 50%, $5 million, I mean, that would be like, oh my gosh, that's huge. But the guy who owns the hospital is like, $5 million is a drop in a bucket over the cost of the entire installation. So I think we sell ourselves short. We make our decisions. The consultant that was working with the healthcare guys started debating and discussing with the health. He had the guy who writes the checks right sitting next to him, who is like, yeah, I'd write you that check. And he's like, well, no, why would you want to spend that much money? I'd be like, oh my God, it's a no-brainer. You say, look, I can get you that level. If you're willing to pay for that, I'll try to do it as most economically feasible as I can. But if reliability is critically important for you and you're willing to spend the money to get it, let's work together. Anyway, that was where we were at. So I would say the actual cost increase of the electrical or overall. And I would say that the overall project cost increase to get selectively coordinated, reliable power distribution system and address the arc flash is not as big of a percentage as you would think. But we only think about the electrical portion. And I think if you made that discussion, that debate with the owner, you would be pleasantly surprised at the response. Okay, now one other item. I get this question all the time too. I think we've answered that one. I didn't do selective coordination through a transformer. We're going to do that next time. I'll do a session next week. The other issue was, how does an inspector, I mean, so here's the problem. If I have a problem with electrical engineers understanding selective coordination, how does an electrical inspector who is responsible for all this other stuff understand selective coordination? So here's what we can do. Two things. One is the specification. I had issues with specifications. Oh, here we go. Here's language. This presentation here, I mean, I should just give this presentation and be done with it. So this is some of the language that we would see in specs. It says, determine settings of overcurrent protected devices to achieve selective coordination. Graphically illustrate that adequate time separation exists between devices installed in series. Well, it's not just separation. Okay, we already said that. Here's another spec. Emergency. NEC Article 700, 0.01 seconds. The code doesn't say 0.01 seconds. The code says all currents, all times. Okay? 0.01 seconds, that BAB breaker downstream of an F-150 had complete separation down to 0.01 seconds, yet does not selectively coordinate, okay, at the fault current values. Legally required systems, 0.01, 0.01, then there's 0.1 for healthcare, equipment branch, and then critical. 0.01 does not mean selective coordination, or does it? It's all in your interpretation. 0.01 seconds is not in the code. Don't use that language. Here's another one. Overcurrent protected devices in electrical distribution systems shall be selectively coordinated to 0.1 seconds. 0.1 seconds is coordination. It's not selective coordination. This is where it starts. And I don't know if inspectors get to review the spec language that the design was made towards, but this is a good place to start to say, what was asked of whoever was providing the quote? Because if I quoted this and I gave you a 0.1 second coordination for an Article 700 system, and I met your spec, and then and the inspector came by and said, hey, ask the right questions, and you said, well, it's selectively coordinated at 0.1 seconds, and the inspector went, well, 0.1 seconds is not selective coordination, and you went back to the supplier, the manufacturer who gave you the quote, and you installed the system, you're going to find out, more than likely, it's not selectively coordinated. It has never been evaluated to any fault current for coordination whatsoever, because it's a 0.1 second system. All we did was look at the trip curves down to 0.1 seconds. I maintain separation, forget about the available fault current, hide the overlap down below. I'm good to go. If you have to selectively coordinate that system, you're going to have to change your design probably. That's going to be a very expensive fix. So I can guarantee that if I was given this to quote that project, I would not be quoting selective coordination. And then you know who pays for it? The design engineer, because of the spec. So what I suggested was language in the specification to be clear. Those portions of the design that specify selective coordination or are required by the National Electrical Code to selectively coordinate are intended to localize the impact of overcurrent condition, thus restricting outages to the circuit or equipment affected, and shall meet the following. A. Overcurrent protective devices must selectively coordinate for the full range of available fault overcurrents, from overload to the maximum. That's right out of the definition. B. Preliminary short circuit study with available fault currents at each bus is available, and you would give that. C. Overcurrent devices shall selectively coordinate with all supply-side overcurrent protective devices up through the normal source and alternate sources. 1. OCPD devices on the emergency side of a transfer switch shall selectively coordinate with all line-side OCPD devices through the normal source. Standard exceptions apply. D. The OCPD devices on the normal side of the emergency system transfer switch, and you have to select, you would make the engineer decide, what are we going to specify? They're not required to selectively coordinate, and it meets the NEC requirement, which it would be true as of before the 2023, because 2023 now mandates those to selectively coordinate. Ensure separation of trip curves for all times greater than 0.1 seconds. You could do 0.1 seconds, or you could selectively coordinate. And then E is documentation shall be included in the forms of manufacturer selective coordination. There's your documentation for your Engleharts of the world. And the selective coordination study shall be performed by a licensed professional engineer or qualified or other qualified persons engaged primarily in the design. So you can have, that's the first place to start. The second place would be what Bussmann puts out, which I think is another good idea. Bussmann puts out a inspection form. And I'll put this all, what I'll do is I'll update my website's blog post, and I'll put a link to this PDF, and I'll put the language, and I'll have to fix this language a little bit, but I'll put this suggested language in there as well. This is your selective coordination inspection form. And it basically, you would put the job name, the job number, the name, the location, the firm. They would walk down through here, select yes, no, or NA, and then sign and date and stamp the bottom. So if you provided something like this to the inspector, this gives you something that you can hang your hat on because it has the right language. The problem I think the problem that we see in the specifications where we are misusing terms. We're saying selectively coordinate to 0.1 seconds. You can't use both of those in the same sentence, okay? So that is a part of our challenge, is to make sure that we're using the right terminology and get that answered straight. So what I would suggest, David and Steve Froming and anybody out there who's an electrical inspector, to ask your design firms on these projects to answer these questions. Give them this checklist. And if you're a design firm, put this checklist in with your package so that the inspector can look at it and say, look, you've met the requirements in 620, 645, 695, 700, 701, and 708 by using this checklist. Or make your own checklist, right? That is what I think takes, because the inspector is going to be relying. I mean, I've heard some inspectors say, well, I'm looking for a PE stamp. But if I said, I'm the engineer of record, and I'm going to stamp this drawing, and I wrote my specification with this type of language that is vague, okay, with that language, or overcurrent protected devices, if I'm the design engineer of record and I made a specification that said, I want you to quote me a project that meets selective coordination to 0.1 seconds, then I don't know what I'm talking about. I am not educated because my spec isn't even educated, right? It's not written correctly. But if you used this type of language, the language directly out of the code in the spec or in a checklist like this, then it takes the engineer's blinders off to say, oh, now I know what selective coordination is and what I need to do to achieve it. So, and then this puts where the rubber meets the road. If I answer these questions and I read that language and I understand the definition, I have a much better chance of giving the project what it needs for the application. Awesome sauce, Mr. Foland. This has not been on my radar, Chris. Yeah, I see this so much, and it's just I can't tell you how many engineers I've spoken to that don't understand the fundamentals. And I did a meeting in California. I'll never forget it as long as I live. The consulting firm was a smaller consulting firm. There's maybe 8 to 10 people in the room. And the owner comes walking in, he sits down, and I'm there to present on selective coordination. And, David, I'll have to fix that. So the owner of the consulting firm looked at me and he says, we do selective coordination for a living. This is what we do. This is how we know selective coordination. I don't need you to sit here and waste time with me teaching me what selective coordination is. I need you to tell me how you're going to save me time and money. And I said, I will do that on one condition. And he goes, what's that? I said, I'm going to give everybody here a quiz. And if you get it right, then I will do exactly what you said. If you get it wrong, then I am going to go through the process of teaching you what selective coordination is. And he said, game on. He says, I'll do that. He said, I'll buy into that. So what I did was I went to the whiteboard and I threw this up on the screen. And I said, do these two breakers selectively coordinate? And I'll tell you, I will never forget this. The youngest person sitting at that table is a young kid. I call it a kid. It was a young kid, probably right out of college. And he raised his hand. Everybody was looking at this. He raised his hand. And I said, you got an answer? He goes, no. He says, and I remember I didn't have this yes, no, maybe. I just had the curves. I drew them by hand. I said, F150, 20. And he said, what's the fault current? I was floored. I looked at him and I was like, wow, that is the right question. He knew right off the bat. And everybody around the table was like, yeah, I can't tell you if those selectively coordinate because you didn't put the fault current up there. And I knew I was dealing with. And I looked over at the owner and I said, all right, here's how I can save you time and money. And I talked about the fuse and breaker ratios and how you can get yourself out of problems by putting a fuse downstream and all that jazz. And it was phenomenal. It was absolutely phenomenal. So, but in any case, David, Nihad El Sharif, thank you. And yes, we're going to have to work on our presentation. David, checklist identifies 701.27. Yep, I'm going to have to. This is based on the 17 code. And you know what? It does say that right there at the top. It says follow the 2017. So what I'll do, it might be a good idea, David, is I will. Sorry about system went haywire here. Yep, I think my dreaded is spinning donut. That was me, guys. I think I'm back. I think I'm back. Am I back? I don't know if I'm back or not. And anyway, am I here? Am I not here? I don't know. Yes, I'm back, Steve. Sorry about that, everybody. My computer just like blew up. Everything was slow, so I had to slow it all down. But thank you, everybody. I think that's an indicator that I got to get my butt moving. I will take a look at the next one, and we'll take a look at selective coordination back through. So we'll take a look at selective coordination. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. We'll have to do the selective coordination through a transformer in our next call. All right. Hopefully audio is back, and I am going to shut it down. Of coordination. All right. Yep. So at least I am back, and it's solid. So thanks everybody for hanging in there. Hopefully everything worked out good, and you got something out of this session. Steve and Pratik and David Englehart, Mr. Froming, everybody, thank you very much for your time and energy today. So thanks for all you do for the electrical industry. Thanks. Hopefully you have a good weekend. Welcome to the 2025 new year and all that jazz. All right. I'm out of here. Take care, stay safe, and please stay healthy. See ya. Me done isn't working. I'm trying to close now. I can't even close. There it is. Boom.